welcome to this session, What Cloud HSM Means to Financial Services. My name is Sam Fansteel. I'm principal at Coalfire, and I have with me three esteemed gentlemen who will speak on the topic of HSM Cloud and Financial Service. I have Bruno Kovacs, the head of security standards and SME for card payments at Card Care. I have Jeff Stapleton, executive director and cybersecurity researcher for Wells Fargo. And I have Partha Chakraborty, Associate VP, Cloud Security, Cyber Innovation, and R&D at Humana. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sam.
Hello, Sam. Thanks for having me here as well.
Absolutely. I'm glad we could all get together for this. I think when we see a title like Cloud HSM for Financial Services, obviously there's three very important terms right there in the title, right? We're talking about HSMs, or hardware security modules. Cryptographic devices that are used ubiquitously to protect sensitive data and keys. We're obviously talking about the cloud. We wouldn't be here if we weren't. Really to understand the overlap here between HSMs and the cloud, and of course for this financial services industry and summit. At this junction is becoming, I think, a more common occurrence than many people may realize. Financial services, technology providers continuing to move their most sensitive data to the cloud. So in this session, gentlemen, let's see if we can have a good conversation about the role that these cloud HSMs play, why organizations may or may not benefit from using them. And I think it would benefit our listeners to hear about the risks associated with implementing cloud HSM for their organization, both the role of security as well as compliance in navigating these changes. So Partha, let's start with you. Maybe you can just kind of bring us up to speed as far as what is a cloud HSM, right? I mean, we think about the cloud, we think of it as being somewhat ethereal, nebulous. We don't think about these hardware security modules. Is a cloud HSM different from an on-premises HSM or maybe one of the other cloud key management systems that we encounter?
Yeah, so the first thing is that, thank you, Sam. So the first thing is that, as the name suggests, cloud and HSM, that is in cloud. That means it is being provided by one of the service provider. Now, we use our HSM, we all are familiar with that, right? To store most critical information, cryptographic operation, and sensitive data. On-prem, we have full control. We have the hardware. What we lack there is the scalability and agility and, making things implemented as fast as possible. Like any other compute that we move to cloud, when we move HSM to the cloud, we get the scale, we get the agility, we at times get also the benefit of lowering the cost, but at the same time, it also comes with some of the challenges with shared responsibility and the risk that definitely we'll dive through. But in summary, the HSM that you have on premises with your control, you can also have it as a service where the service provider actually builds, creates, maintains for you and gives you the API and the ability to configure and use it for your need.
Gotcha. So it is exactly how the title describes. Nothing hidden here when we talk about cloud HSM. Well, Bruno, I would like to turn it over to you. I'd love to hear, because I know you're in the financial services space directly, where do you most often see HSMs being used in your organization or across the industry?
Absolutely. So from our perspective in the card payment industry, we've seen at least interest in the adoption of cloud HSMs, if that's what you're asking for, at least in the last few years in the payment acceptance and transaction acquiring organizations, willing to, for example, use cloud HSMs for PIN translation or for connecting their entities to switching and interchange networks. But we've also seen more recent interest from a broader perspective, essentially from card vendors wishing to perform EMV data preparation to carry on. I mean, even there are solutions targeting card issuers with turnkey solutions for, say, backend card management systems and for authorization systems as well. These are a few of the examples where we've seen interest in adoption for cloud HSMs on our side.
Right. And Jeff, there at Wells Fargo and across the industry, where do you see just HSMs in general being used? Are there some use cases maybe that Bruno that you and Bruno kind of come up with together that might represent the breadth of some of these use cases?
Well, Bruno hit on the payment side very well. So we've got, the entry of the PIN translation, the PIN verification. If you're doing the card payments, you've got the CVV generation, the CVV verification, and that's the card space. But you've also got PAN encryption, which is preferred to be using an HSM, but it's not really mandated. Outside of payments, you've got a lot of other usage, particularly if you're looking at a public key infrastructure, for example. The certificate authorities would put their private signing keys to create the certs inside of the HSMs. Some of the cloud providers offer PKI services, some do not. Some organizations have private PKIs. Some organizations use public PKIs. Some do all three. And another area is you're starting to see a lot of use of database HSMs with database encryption. So the keys used to encrypt the data within the database have to be managed. And a lot of organizations like using HSMs for that.
Right. So HSMs in general are really ubiquitous across any organization that needs to protect data, but whether confidentiality or integrity.
Well, they are, but we're also seeing a lot of usage where we're not using HSMs. Like your TLS connections typically do not use HSMs, for example.
I see. Interesting. So there may be some risk, relative risk, and or traditional models that may or may not evolve at the same time, right? We may move some of our services to cloud HSM, while others may linger behind, or may already be in the cloud, for that matter.
Right, and sometimes the choice is to use cryptographic software because it is on-prem, it's on your network, you have control. But when you move to the cloud, the risk factors change, so you need to reconsider that.
Good point. So before we start talking about risk, then it might help to just get an idea. We talked about what a cloud HSM is. Bruno, maybe if I could have you kind of talk a little bit about what are some of the shared responsibility breakdowns when you're talking about a customer and their cloud HSM solution or service provider. How do those responsibilities generally land?
Yeah, so that will definitely depend on the service model. And currently what we see is, for example, IaaS and SaaS. So if generally what we see in an infrastructure as a service type, cloud HSM, we see that the HSM itself is generally single tenant. It is dedicated to the customer. And of course, I mean, what we see in this services is that the customer has full control and ownership of the keys. So for example, if you take the master file key that protects the customer's key store, that will be entirely managed by the customer, which is interesting. Also, in this sort of service model, the customer will have full control generally over the HSM configuration, API commands, even will be able to choose a firmware version that is most adequate to the customer. We've seen also from our side a variation of a IaaS service model, which is called bring your own HSM, where the customer can actually go to the data center and be able to perform initializations. I mean, to customize. I mean, to generate this master file key and be able to get out of the data center with the assurance that the key is established, is commissioned as according to their own security procedures. But there are also, as I mentioned before, SaaS type solutions. And in this case, generally the HSM will be multi-tenant. It will not, so essentially will be shared with other customers. And in this case, this high-level key that protects the customer key store is actually owned and managed by the service provider, which is just not the same thing essentially. And essentially, there is a dashboard, you can monitor your HSM, but you cannot actually control the low-level security configuration. Perhaps the customer is not able to see all the low-level audit logs, for example. And I mean, I think interesting. There is probably a new service model coming in the next few years, which is the CaaS, the container as a service. As new HSMs are now bringing the possibility to isolate logical instances at a container level and even manage dedicated firmware, for each of the customers. So it's something between IaaS and SaaS, where it's still sharing the firmware, still sharing the hardware, the HSM hardware, but the customer has much more flexibility to manage the security configuration and everything.
Gotcha. So each one of those breakdown really are places or opportunities, but really risks associated with ensuring that the service provider has demonstrated, some level of satisfaction of vendor risk, whether it be compliance or just security. I think to that end, you other gentlemen, any other scenarios that you can think of that may be relevant here when we start to talk about breaking down responsibilities at the various levels within the stack?
Well, I'll mention that Bruno covered it very well, and he hit on something really critical. The models are changing. So what was available, because I've been doing this crypto stuff now for about 30 something years, and I've been looking at what I call cloud cryptography, and that's in air quotes, for about the last 8 years or so. And it has changed dramatically just in the last 5 years. So things are changing, and he hit that point very well. But also, not all of them, the cloud providers all offer the exact same services. There's some differences, how they approach it, the service levels, service level agreements. It's all just a little different. So it can be very confusing.
Yeah, just wanted to add something perhaps I missed in SaaS services, for example. What generally customers look for are what we call key agent services. So essentially, the service provider will be directly involved in key management processes, exchanging keys with third parties, and the service provider will then be offering the service and performing the service on behalf of the customer. So this is something that really depends on what the company wants to delegate or not in terms of processes and cryptographic assets, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and those changes in key management, then we have two changes going on simultaneously. We have more of a logical flow that may be impacted by physicality of the HSM being off premises, and then we have this trust in a third party. Maybe Partha, maybe you can kind of parse that a little bit for us. What does moving your HSMs to the cloud really mean from a key management standpoint?
Right. So first thing is that great points covered by Bruno and Jeff. So when I look at HSM moving into the cloud, yes, there are some security concerns because we are moving a lot of the sensitive information and probably the most sensitive information and moving to the cloud and taking the benefit from a service provider. But there are certain reasons for it, be it cost, be it complexity, be it scalability, be it something. So when you get some benefit, it is never a one-way street. It's like a two-way, whatever you get, right? You get some ease of use, flexibility, cost saving. It will come at the cost of something. And the tax you pay is security, your risk tolerance level. Is it maintaining all your standards and policies that your organization have? Most likely it will not. So you will have to modify and have your updated standards. So one of the major challenge, be it IaaS, yes, you have the full access of the master key, you can still control and maintain. But the bare metal, the hardware, and the underlying thing that is being done by the service provider depends on the level of trust and confidence you have on the service provider's practices. You will have a different posture or a risk appetite, and then you will design your countermeasures, like what kind of checks and balances you will implement. SaaS, yes, it is more on the service provider side. I love the idea of like a container as a service. But even if you do, even today, container as a service where you host your applications today, there are certain areas or risks that you always inherit, right? One of the things is that it's a shared responsibility model in everywhere. And then there are issues of user errors, like the human errors can happen at any point of time. It can be intentional, it can be unintentional. Then the shared responsibility model also takes away a lot of the visibility, like the auditing and logging. integration with your SIM. If it is not accurate, then if something is happening on the fly, you are not able to detect and respond and remediate, then you're in trouble. So addressing all those risks, be it whatever shared model you use with a service provider, you need to have a very strong key management practices. You have full control of your key management practices when it is on-prem. When it goes to cloud, yes, there are some compromises you have to make, but you have to stick to the basics. And the basics is generation process, like selecting the right algorithm, selecting the right key size, like secure storing, like rotation and revocation, all the 20 things that you do in the key management practices, which is sticking to the basics and trying to implement those things in the cloud provider that you have to manage and maintain. Otherwise, you'll have the risk. The challenge here will be every cloud provider does it in a different way, and you also have a problem with the vendor lock-in as well. So you have to keep those things in mind, right? How you incorporate those things. But the bottom line is that in light of those risks of having a shared responsibility model, user configuration error, lack of visibility, co-located infrastructure, you need to have even much more emphasis in a stronger key management practices when you're using the HSM in cloud.
Yeah, Sam, I'd like to add, Partha touched on something really important there. Despite the shared responsibilities, despite the transition to the cloud, the core requirements, the industry standards, the ISO standards that deal with PIN management, key management, and PAN management, and so on, and PKI management, those standards, those requirements are not changing. They're still out there. You just have to figure out how you're going to do them in the cloud.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. You know, I'm honored to be the moderator in this panel, but one of the things I do in my day job is I audit against those standards, and I can definitely affirm that what you're saying is often true, right? Many of the standards should be worded in such a way as to be objective based, right? What is the objective that we're trying to obtain so that a cloud or on-premises solution can really adapt based on meeting that objective? Sometimes they're more prescriptive. But that's really upon the standards bodies to really adapt those where necessary. Well, speaking of adapting the standards, you know, we've talked about kind of this in key management. We talk, you know, often we talk about symmetric key management because it's a very straightforward way to understand. But we also see a lot of asymmetric key management. You mentioned PKI earlier, or TLS, and we also, gosh, I mean, I hate to jump too far, but we have to be thinking about post-quantum cryptographic, you know, exploits and algorithms. Can you maybe, Jeff, just comment on that a little bit? Like, is Cloud HSM ready for this? You mentioned CAs for PKI, so clearly there are use cases that have been contemplated for Cloud HSM with asymmetric cryptography. But how about PQC? Where do we stand as an industry for this?
Well, it gets complicated. So let's be real clear on something. When a cryptographically relevant quantum computer, and they're not there yet, but they're getting there, they will evolve, when it becomes real, we know that the public key algorithms that we use today will be at high risk. They'll be breakable. So we're going to have to replace them with quantum resistant algorithms. NIST is working on them. The drafts are out. But you have to keep in mind is that these are the round 3 drafts. They're still working on round 4 candidates, and they did another call out for new digital signature algorithms. So we're going to be seeing a whole new world of the next gen of asymmetric cryptography. The vendors are not going to offer that for production use yet because they want the FIPS to be published. But you can't get beta versions. A lot of organizations are already doing pre-testing to see how it fits. But a lot of the industry standards we talked about earlier, your TLS, your SSH, your IPsec, they're all going to have to be upgraded to address these new algorithms.
Yeah.
And it will also depend like how ready the provider is, the future thinking. And then, I mean, if it becomes a standard, they have to adopt it pretty quickly. Otherwise, they will not be relevant and people will not be using them. So they will definitely be moving. The challenge as a customer we will have is that every cloud provider will have a different way of doing it. So you at times get locked in with the vendor lock-in challenges because the APIs are different and it is not so easy to adopt and implement a new way of doing automation, new way of doing your API depending on the cloud provider. So that is something as the consumer side of the industry, when we are selecting a cloud HSM provider, keeping those things in mind, that a post-quantum thing coming up, they will be changing, there will be some changes coming down the line. So what is our strategy? Are we okay with the vendor lock-in? Are we looking into some reference style of an architecture where it will be very easy to swap service provider? Though easier said, in reality, it is not that easy, but those are the factors that needs to be kept in mind when we are thinking about PQC as well.
Yeah, we just add that with HSMs, we have the advantage of being able to update the firmware quite easily. I mean, comparing to other sort of equipment that are on the ground, on the field, and not as reachable as the HSMs, I mean, to receive the update. So this is quite a challenge as well. But the HSMs, the advantage is that they get updated on a constant basis.
Well, you mentioned earlier that may be one of the responsibilities of the service provider, or the cloud service provider, to maintain the core firmware potentially, or there are some virtualized HSMs that give you the ability, potentially could give the cloud service customer the ability to manage their own firmware. Remains to be seen. Again, implementation specific, but those are good points that you make. So it sounds like just using PQC as an example, there might be reasons for some organizations to say, look, I trust a cloud service provider to handle some of these more advanced configurations, at the lower level, so that I can really interact using more familiar APIs and things that are part of our cloud strategy. So what are some of the other maybe benefits to a financial services organization that's looking, Bruno, maybe if you'd like, any other benefits that you could think of, why they might want to move to a cloud HSM versus either on-prem or another cloud key management option?
Yeah, okay. So I think there are many motivations for that. Of course, it depends really on the company profile, meaning we were talking about risk tolerance before and cloud maturity, for example, of the organization. But at least from our side, we've seen both fintech companies and also big organizations with a track record managing HSMs for a number of years, both being interested in studying the possibility of adopting cloud HSMs, for example. So we've seen some industry players wishing to adopt cloud HSMs and keep the business applications internally. And in this case, they would be really looking to the delegation of key management responsibilities, not having to build, for example, key ceremony room internally, having to train key management staff, having key management staff train them, having all the saves, having the processes, and also be subject to assessments on that scope. So they were, one of the motivations was around the delegation to a trusted body to do all of that. It goes with delegation of compliance responsibilities as well. As you know, as an assessor, the service provider it's kind of the extension of the service, but if they delegate, it becomes their responsibility to do that. And so these are two motivations that come to my mind. If we now talk about other organizations that we've seen, they actually have broader move to cloud strategies for their payment applications. So essentially, as the HSMs are part of the solutions, they also look into cloud HSMs as a whole. I mean, as part of the solution that goes into the cloud. And in this case, I'd like to come back to what Partha was saying in the beginning. They are worried. They are interested in getting the resilience, better service availability rates, getting the footprint, the easy, expanding the solution footprint in different geographic locations with the agility of cloud and cloud HSMs, and without having to worry or manage the hardware aspects of HSMs, having to install them, rack them, etc. To carry on a little bit on this, there are companies which are adopting hybrid architectures, so part on premises, part in cloud, and for this sort of organization, what we've seen is some of them are looking to move to cloud-only development and test environments, for example, keep production on premises. Others are looking to cloud HSMs to absorb peak workload, like additional workload and during peak hours or peak time frames, or maybe as well as part of their DRP to save costs. I mean, maintaining DRP sites with the cloud, it becomes probably cheaper if we are paying per according to the workload and traffic that is going through the platform, for example. And perhaps just to wrap up on this, I think, I mean, again, it's back to the agility of being able to size resources according to service increase and decrease. And with HSMs, we have throughput. Generally, with harder HSMs, we'll have to buy an HSM hardware that is, which will be able to do enough throughput, even though the company does not require that throughput. They need to buy in advance a hardware that is capable of doing it. And in the cloud, they are able to scale as they go.
Right. One thing it was interesting as I was listening to Bruno here. My background mostly on the financial services for 16, 18 years, and then I'm working in the healthcare right now as well for the last 4 years. So it doesn't matter whatever option we choose, it's always a thing that there is a trade-off that we need to do. One of the scenarios that Bruno was talking where HSM sits in cloud, application stays in on-prem, you'll be hit by latency at some point of time. You need to address those things and you need to design and do some trade-off for that. The other scenario, like critical applications staying in cloud and HSM is also cloud, that is the best solution considering latency and the cost and the agility and everything. But you have the additional complexity of you need to ensure you have the best key management solution, your organizational policies, you have the visibility, you have the alerting system so that you're not blind, whoever is managing that HSM, even if it is a SaaS model or even container as a service model. The third one is your applications are on-prem and your HSM is staying on-prem. The best of the world, but you may not be able to scale properly, right, when the demand increases. And your agility, buying hardware, putting it into the data center rack and stack and all, that is going to have an impact. So regardless of whatever you choose, I would say like there are particular use cases which are fit for a particular solution. So there is no one size that fits all. Out of your application, out of your requirement, just categorize which ones are the right candidate for Cloud HSM, where you get the most benefit with the least amount of risk. And I would not call like least amount of risk. The risk, what you can manage, and risk which is within your tolerance level.
I completely agree with that.
Yes, Sam, these are all good points, but there's one other aspect we haven't talked about yet, I think, is when it comes to cloud HSMs, we've talked about private cloud, public cloud, and Bruno mentioned hybrid cloud, but a lot of organizations are looking at multi-cloud. Yeah. So now you're dealing with more than one cloud service provider and maybe more than one type of cloud HSM. So the interoperability is going to be a bigger issue for some organizations than others.
And Jeff, that's a great point. Not only in HSM, right? I have worked in the companies which deal with like 2 or 3 different clouds. Even for managing and maintaining containers, deploying applications, right? And the container orchestration systems, you have the challenge. You have a different set of APIs your developers are used to using in one CSP, completely different in another CSP. There are technology companies coming up who writes an abstraction layer so that you developer, the same set of like a Gen AI kind of thing, hey, give me this. So you write an abstraction layer, it is going to do the translation. But that industry is not moving faster. So one service provider making so many API changes, the second provider, which provides an abstraction layer, which can work provider independent API so that your developer has only one interface, they cannot move as fast as possible. And as a result, it comes with the challenge that you end up writing your own integration. So management and operation, those are some of the concerns. So that is why even for the multi-cloud scenarios, again, planning properly for the right use case is the most important thing. What people do is that they jump into that cloud pretty quick without realizing what best benefit I will get. And once they are deep into the water, then they realize, okay, now I have to either revert back or I need to know how to swim better. So think about it, plan properly, find the right use case. Don't jump into multiple multi-cloud HSM and all if it is not absolutely needed. If it is needed, figure it out. Do you have the capability to write your own integration and operability? If not, if there is any third party which can provide you that easily, otherwise that will be a problem. So those things has to be have a careful consideration. My mantra for cloud migration, I have been doing it for many organizations, is that take more time in thinking through the scenarios and the value and benefit and the design. Execution is faster. If you do proper planning, you will not have any issues with execution. But if you don't spend enough time in planning, then your execution and re-execution and redoing those things, it goes in cycles for years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and one of those considerations that, again, just because it's near and dear to my heart, is the impact of a compliance, regimen on those movements, right? We've kind of touched and danced around it in many different areas, from key management to firmware version to physicality of the HSM or physical security. So maybe just, I don't know, I'll open this up to whoever wants to jump on it, but what types of compliance considerations should our audience be thinking about? I mean, we throw out, words like PCI somewhat flippantly, but more, let's point our audience maybe in the right direction. What are some of those standards or some of those just general areas that they should really be, as you pointed out, Partha, doing that preparation work so they don't find themselves in a non-compliant state during this operation?
I can have few things on top of my head, which usually we interact. PCI comes across section 3.6 specifically requires for, okay, you need to have HSM type of a solution. But again, this is not a generic thing. Not all the regulations explicitly ask for it, right? HIPAA, I think there is something called a security rule section where it says it is recommended. Same with FFIEC, right? There is a recommendation, NIST 800-57. I forgot the exact language, whether it's a recommendation or nice to have or a best practice guidelines sort of a thing. ISO has a different thing. But bottom line is that even though they don't directly say for something, when you are doing auditing, and if you are a service provider, right, if you are not an enterprise consumer, and if you build your software to serve someone, you will end up into a situation where the different interpretation of those words essentially will be given to you that you must have HSM. You must have those security things. So better that if you're in an enterprise organization, when you are doing those external audits or third party and all those stuff, or you're a technology provider, though we are talking about financial clouds right now, the ecosystem expands beyond the consumers. I mean, there are providers, there are suppliers, and everyone. So in those kind of scenarios, it is safe to assume, doesn't matter whether it is FFIEC or PCI or GDPR or your HIPAA, or even if you follow the NIST guideline, you need to have an HSM sort of a thing. It is kind of a de facto standard, right? Without that, you should not be keeping your sensitive crypto operation in the cloud.
Yeah, I'd like to jump into what Partha was saying regarding compliance requirements. You mentioned PCI, and in the car payment industry, we do require specific certifications for HSMs. So Sam, for example, we discussed about FIPS 140-2 or -3 as a minimum, or there's PCI HSM as well, as in an evaluation program for HSM. It's important to make the difference when we talk about cloud HSM, and we are still kind of finding out how it works. I mean, at least in the car payment industry, we do have physical HSMs, a fleet of physical HSMs. We're not talking about software HSMs, which could be accepted in other industries, but it's not the case, at least in the car payments, maybe in other financial services sectors as well. And the other thing is really about what I usually like to say is that the service provider provides, as the name says, a service. So it's a pack of processes, procedures, especially if they're managing keys on behalf of the customer. So the environment and these processes must be subject to equivalent requirements. So if you are subject to PCI P2P or PCI PIN or TSP, your service provider must also be able to demonstrate compliance to those requirements, managed the same way as you would have to do internally.
Yeah, when we mentioned PCI, we talked about the DSS program with the qualified security assessors. We talked about the HSM requirements. We now have the PIN requirements, and we launched a brand new QPA, Qualified PIN Assessor program. So things will change. Things will get better. Things will shift.
Yeah. And I would add to that, with the P2PE program, similar to PIN, has those physical HSM requirements, FIPS 140-2 or 3 or PTS. So does the 3D Secure standard in financial services. If you're doing cardholder verification for card not present, there's so many standards that, certainly consult with your audit, your assessor company. I think it's probably the best guidance that I could provide, just to make sure that you're not overlooking any of those controls, because, for instance, and some of these things are always moving, but at one point the 3D Secure standard, required certain ISO certifications on the HSM for remote administration. Well, if your HSM is by definition remote to you, then those ISO requirements would apply. Now, they've recently modified the FAQ for that, which is normative, which means that it now takes effect for those organizations to loosen some of the requirements. They now require MFA in lieu of or in addition to the ISO HSM independent laboratory certification requirements. But those are the types of things that your assessor might have more familiarity with, depending on the level of subject matter expertise that your organization has. So yeah, these are big changes. Another, I think maybe you guys could comment. I mean, you're losing physical reach to the HSM, but you're also losing control over the physical environment. Now, most physical security requirements, especially within the PCI regime, require some of the same sorts of requirements, but then there are some which exceed those, such as additional monitoring on the HSMs themselves, or maybe even inspections. The P2PE requirements require the HSMs be inspected. Well, if you no longer have the ability to walk into a data center and do those inspections, you've got to ensure that your cloud service provider or selected third party is doing those inspections again, or run the risk of failing to meet that control objective. Are there any other, kind of pitfalls that you guys can think of? Not to get too far into the weeds, but just to get our audience thinking about some of the things they need to be exploring.
I mean, Sam, you are an expert doing an audit in this field. So these are the 4 or 5 things that we deal with that. But as you were telling, okay, you may lose direct access, it will be remote, but the thing is that if we follow those things, we'll not be losing sleep over it just being there in the cloud, right? At least we'll have a peace of mind. So those audit requirements are done for a reason. The only thing is that, again, as we all deal with audit, it can be done in multiple ways, right? The interpretation of the word. Can we do in a loosely way that, okay, I have a software isolation that is good enough? But what I will say is that when it comes to HSM and your most sensitive information, when you are putting it in the cloud, just take those words of audit in a little bit more seriously and try to implement the stricter controls, as opposed to just meeting the audit guideline or requirement. It's not just audit. Audit is, you may pass audit, but the bad actors are not going to go by your audit certification. So try to implement the best possible control you can have when you are keeping your HSM in the cloud.
Yeah. I think you touched on, sorry, I was just going to say, I think that Jeff touched on one that I meant to mention as well under PCI DSS 4 with the HSM for cardholder data storage is not an HSM requirement, but to your point, Partha, that may be the risk level that needs to be obtained. And that's addressed through the targeted risk assessment under PCI DSS 4. So you might have, especially if we're dealing with FinTech and FinServe companies that are dealing with hundreds of thousands or millions of credit cards being stored, your own targeted risk assessment might dictate the need to have an HSM protecting the keys and ultimately the storage of those data, whether they be flat files or database protections.
Right.
Bruno, I think you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was going to come back to something you just said before, Sam, regarding losing the visibility on the physical premises where the HSMs are hosted. I think I would encourage, for example, listeners, for example, to look into, for example, the CSA. I know most CSPs they do adopt CSA, CCM, for example, which provide an overarching framework for managing physical security, logical security at all the layers that are managed by the CSP, and this goes very well with. If we blend them together, PCI standards, CSA, ISO standards as well. There is ISO 27001 with ISO 27017, which is adapted to cloud environments. So we have a number of, there's NIST, I guess, as well. There's a number of requirements, and CSPs, they tend to adopt and demonstrate compliance with all of those. And I think all of them blended together, they should be able to provide enough assurance to the customers that these physical threats are countered. But not to forget, I think we touched on this in a few cases, but the customer, we should not forget that when the customer carries key management responsibilities, the customer must also maintain that physical boundary around the keys that they manage. They must be stored correctly. So just because you're delegating to a service provider doesn't mean that you're kind of do not have any it's about the sharing, as we discussed before. Just not to lose sight of that.
One of the things that I've seen, and just anecdotally, but maybe an issue for some of our audience, is when you are delegating certain keys within the key hierarchy to your cloud service provider, it doesn't mean they completely go away in terms of, yes, you don't have control or access to those keys, but you need to know about how the protections are provided for your critical key infrastructure. And if that is a black box to you, that's another discovery opportunity, is to say, okay, what is the key strength of the master key of this HSM? Because that's one that I, as an auditor, would be asking. I have to know that, because it is ultimately the linchpin of that key crypto system. So that's just another area that, again, it's not that you necessarily need to worry about it being insecure, but you do need to at least discover those answers like that as you go about your discovery process. Well, gentlemen, I think we've really talked about almost everything I can think of in this area. I would just kind of turn it over to anyone who has any final thoughts about, maybe it's about how do we as an industry become more agile. Crypto agility is one of those terms that we hear a lot, where we can be prepared, whether it be for PQC or whether it be for movement to all these different industry trends that we've talked about here today, the movement to private cloud, public cloud, multi-cloud, or whatever comes beyond that, right? So, any thoughts there before we wrap up?
Yeah, I can offer you, one last thought is I chair one of the work groups in X9, and we have been working on a new cloud management and security standard. We are finally in the ballot process, and I think you will be seeing it coming out soon.
All right.
Yeah, for me, by profession, I'm a security architect. So I spend more time on planning, thinking, and concept and design phase than into an execution phase. So I would say when we are dealing with cloud HSM and all, so stick to the basics, do the right thing, choose the right use cases, do not overload where it doesn't make sense and take unnecessary risk. Do defense in depth, think about the integration, the API, and the availability, and the alerting, monitoring, visibility, and the strong key management practices and all. So bottom line, whatever we do as the basic things, stick to the basics, implement a defense in depth, take those things seriously when it comes to HSM, and just double check to ensure, because it is the most sensitive data in cloud. So whatever you do for other applications in cloud, you at least ensure even you put more effort to ensure you have a layered defense and controls when you are keeping data or HSM in cloud.
Good advice.
Yeah, I could perhaps just add something to what Partha just said. So speaking of getting back to the basics, I would say it's always important to consider the value of your crypto assets that you're delegating to a third party. So it's not the same thing as if you're delegating card master issuing keys for physical cards or for digital cards or just for PIN translation. It's not the same impact if they are compromised. So physical cards, you have to revoke them. It would cost a fortune to replace them on the field. While for other sort of business contexts, you can more easily, revoke the keys, replace the keys, etc. So yeah, it's really about having your mindset straight about what you're delegating and the value of your assets, essentially.
Excellent. Well, gentlemen, I do thank you each for joining me today. This has been amazing and very helpful, I hope, to everyone in attendance. I think I would like to add another little plug. Might be useful. The CSA working group that many of us are on for the cloud key management has just released the HSM as a services best practice document, as well as key management best practices, both of which overlap tremendously with this discussion. So I would encourage anyone listening who hasn't already done so to visit cloudsecurityalliance.org to download those white papers. And I do wish everyone that has joined a very pleasant day. Thank you so much. And again, to my distinguished panelists, thank you again for engaging in this conversation.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much.